Thank you, Jim, for the invitation to talk about COP28, what the main outcome of this COP is and what the implications are. I'm trying to provide a realistic as possible assessment of where we are in terms of climate policy and the whole climate movement. After all, we've seen these kind of meetings every year for nearly 30 years. It's COP28, and I'm pretty sure there will be COP42 and 55 and so on. This will be ongoing for some time. To cut my assessment short, we almost predicted the whole kind of ritual, the hopes, the claims that time is running out, that this is our last chance, that there will be a deadlock, then that there will be a breakthrough, and then everyone will celebrate the breakthrough, the deal, and then when they read the small print, they tend to realize just how little actually has been achieved. So this has been the kind of annual COP ritual, and COP28 hasn't disappointed to being exactly in the same vein. So remember that the kind of Western governments were adamant that this was the COP to phase out fossil fuels, just like Glasgow was the COP to phase out coal. And of course, everyone knows that instead of coal being phased out, countries are desperate to get their hands on coal. And the same, obviously, is going to happen with fossil fuels. These kind of statements and the rhetoric has very little meaning. We know that these deals are non-binding anyhow. So let's focus on one of the key paragraphs of this agreement, which essentially says that this deal promises a transitioning away from fossil fuels in the energy system, very important. We're here limiting this whole transition to the energy system, beginning in this decade in an orderly, equitable manner, so as to achieve net zero by 2050, keeping with the science. Okay, so this is being celebrated as a historic first, that this has been mentioned, a transitioning away from fossil fuels, as if this hasn't been discussed for 30 years and hasn't been part of the Paris Agreement. But what is more important is, for the first time that I can remember, this COP has given a rubber stamp for fossil fuels, because the deal agreed, and I quote, it says, transitional fuels can play a role in facilitating the energy transition while ensuring energy security. So the COP recognizes the role of transitional fuels. Okay, what are transitional fuels? Well, the Chinese will say coal is a transitional fuel because we're transitioning away from coal, so that's a transitional fuel. The Gulf states will say, well, gas is a transitional fuel because we're, is a bridge to the future. Gas is a bridge to the future. So, and of course, the Saudis will say oil is a transitional fuel because, we need another bridge from, the conventional cars to the electric cars. We need oil as a transitional fuel. So this statement within the deal that transitional fuels are given kind of the green light that they are, important for the energy transition and ensuring energy security, obviously totally contradicts the claim that this COP agreed to phase out fossil fuels. So what we've seen is a continuation of the divide between the developed and the developing world. And I want to start by mentioning two BBC stories that were published yesterday on the BBC website that are quite revealing. And so the first one was by Justin Rowland, the BBC climate editor, and he interviewed the energy minister of Uganda about why Uganda and so many developing nations were against the demand to phase out fossil fuels. This were the kind of the EU and the US basically wanted that phrase, phasing out fossil fuel, in the agreement. And a lot of the developing nations, who you would expect to be very concerned about climate change, were adamant that they were against that phrase. And what she said is that the transition, the energy transition wouldn't be very cheap, and that they needed all the income from the oil and gas to facilitate the energy transition. And they said, and she said, well, if the wealthy countries don't pay up, we need all the money to transition to a green energy system. And the second story was by another BBC journalist who interviewed the director of the Iraqi climate change department. And he showed her pictures of drought in Iraq and said that 7-8 million people faced, having no access to water, and that climate change is a big challenge for Iraq, and that they needed all the money from oil and gas to deal with climate change, because without the money, they couldn't deal with climate change. So what was interesting is these countries, these developing countries, and we've known that for a long time, they are not on board of the idea that they should now give up on their own energy resources. That's nothing new. We've known that for many years, at least since the Copenhagen COP. But what is more interesting is that, of course, everyone knows what's going on in Europe. For instance, to give you an example, in Germany, the last 3 nuclear power plants were shut down earlier this year, and coal has to be phased out as well, although they don't know exactly when. But the interesting thing is that the government, in their climate plans, are planning to build 40 new gas-fired power plants. So everyone knows that instead of, transitioning away or phasing out fossil fuels, Germany is in the process of building 40 new gas-fired power plants. There are more than 1,000 coal-fired power plants being planned or under construction in the world. Again, there's no evidence of a phase down or phase out of coal. India has announced that it is going to increase their domestic coal production by 60% in the next 10 years. China is commissioning coal power plants as if there's no tomorrow. So the reality, and in many Asian countries, you see more coal being committed all the time. And of course, the Chinese, what is interesting, we actually predicted that there would be a kind of compromise, a compromise agreement in the end, because let's face it, the Chinese and the Americans who had met already, I think 3-4 weeks before, had already agreed a text. And that text basically predetermined the outcome of the COP. They had already agreed that renewables should be increased threefold. And interestingly, by the way, if you increase renewables in Germany threefold, there's enough renewables to power the whole country when the wind is blowing, right? And the problem, of course, as we now know, and this is part of the crisis of the climate movement, is that the whole renewable energy agenda is in a deep crisis. First of all, there's a deep cost crisis. So the costs have gone up significantly. Projects have been cancelled in almost all countries because of the cost. But the bigger problem, even bigger than the cost problem, is the realization that you cannot power a country on renewables alone. That realization, and of course, we've always been told that with storage, you can solve the problem of intermittency, but it's becoming obvious that the cost and the technological challenges of storing these kind of gigantic amounts of electricity is just unfeasible. And so we are in a situation where the renewable energy agenda is in deep crisis because governments begin to realize that they essentially have to have two energy systems parallel. One, the renewables that when the wind blows and the sun shines, generates enough electricity, but when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, generates nothing. So you have a growing realization that the green energy agenda is in crisis. You may remember that the green energy stocks have suffered a severe decline this year. In the US alone, they lost more than $30 billion, whereas traditional energy stocks have gained significantly. So what is more is the realization that the energy agencies are beginning to realize that what governments around the world are planning in terms of their energy system and the growing energy demand around the world, particularly in the developing world, and the demands for the reduction of CO2, the divide is deepening. The US Energy Agency, the US Energy Information Administration, published just at the beginning of the COP their projection for the next 25 years. And they said almost every projection, and they've looked around the world and they just looked at what governments are planning to do in the next 20, 25 years. And they are quite certain that CO2 emissions from coal, oil, and gas will increase over the next 25 years because energy demand is going to grow. So countries will rely on more of these fuels rather than less. So growing populations, growing income, increases fossil fuel consumption and emissions. in particular in the industrial and electric power sectors. And these trends totally contradict, of course, the demands by the climate scientists, because they are saying, look, you, international community, agreed the Paris Agreement, which limits the global temperatures to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and you have to essentially reduce CO2 emissions dramatically in the next 10, 20 years if you want to keep this threshold alive. So on top of this discrepancy, the growing demand for fossil fuels contra the growing demand for less emissions, you have the renewable energy crisis. And as a result of the renewable energy crisis, because let's face this, if renewable energies were as efficient and as cost efficient and as cheap as we've been told for the last 30 years, countries around the world would deploy them, but they are not. The renewables remain a very tiny segment of the global energy mix. In fact, the global energy mix hasn't changed that much in 30 years. It's still roughly 80% fossil fuels. It was about 80% fossil fuels 30 years ago. So, and the reason, obviously, is the growing economies, a growing energy demand. Of course, renewables have grown as well, but not in a significant manner to diminish the huge chunk of fossil fuels in the energy mix. And as a result of these crises, countries who have pledged to move away from coal, like South Africa, Indonesia, and who've been offered 25, 30 billion pounds, huge amounts of money to move away from coal, are reneging. There was a big story in the Wall Street Journal saying these countries are sticking to coal because for them it's the cheapest and the most secure form of energy, and they're not going to give up. So on top of this, we have a problem in the kind of promotion of electric vehicles. There is a growing realization that in the Western world, at least, most people who wanted to buy an electric vehicle, mainly as a second or third car, they've now bought an electric vehicle. So the demand is shrink, or is perhaps not going up. Let's put it this way. And governments are struggling with a public backlash, particularly in Europe, but also in the US, on the green agenda because of the cost issue. The costs of energy have gone up. The cost of the policies have gone up. People have been asked to basically give up their traditional heating, give up their traditional cars. So there's a huge public backlash, which is reflected in a lot of populist parties being elected in Europe. We've seen it recently in Holland. We've seen the election in Argentina by Javier Milei, who says, instead of transitioning away from fossil fuels, he's pledged to use the resources that there are, the Argentinian shale resources, which are abundant, and he wants to accelerate the extraction of shale gas. On top of all of this, we have an economic crisis in Europe as higher energy bills force a lot of industries abroad. So you have an exodus of industries. A lot of businesses are curbing investments and are eyeing production abroad. And there is no surprise that in a country with high energy costs and high labor costs, it's not very attractive for investment. So the reality is that COP28 wasn't so much really a climate summit. It was foremost an energy summit. It was all about energy. The tripling of renewables. There were even some countries who wanted to triple nuclear power. Of course, renewables were traded as well. But basically, the debate in Dubai was primarily about energy and energy policy. So that, in a way, and we've seen this in Europe for the last 12, 18 months, that the energy cost crisis is focusing minds. The UK government has watered down some net zero policies. President Macron in France has said we need a kind of moratorium, a pause on new plans for net zero. The German government is in disarray about their climate policies. And there's a growing rebellion against the whole net zero agenda throughout Europe. And there will be European elections next year. And I expect quite severe opposition on the unpopular net zero agenda. I expect populist parties to make significant gains, which could severely undermine the climate agenda as it is. So to sum up, I would say for the first time that I can remember, the political mood in Europe, at least, perhaps also in the US, but the US always has been more divided than Europe and more kind of split on this issue. But for the first time that I can remember, the issue of cost, the issue of energy policy and energy security, and the issue of climate, the climate agenda, and the net zero agenda has been really more important and more in the public domain than the climate science. I mean, you have hardly heard in the last 2 weeks anything. I mean, we heard that this will be the warmest year on record. Yeah, we've heard that quite a number of times, but that was it, right? And some people say, oh, you would need to, phase out fossil fuels because we have to stick to the 1.5 degree target. But basically, this was not anymore about science or climate science. This was about, which forms of energy are most important for our economies and our security. And my reading of the situation is that this will remain for the time being as the cost of energy remains high. And still rising. This won't go away, and the opposition to unpopular net zero policies will grow, and in all likelihood will be reflected in a very strong, rebellious European election next year. And in a way, governments are being mugged by reality, and the reality is that the net zero agenda is economically and technologically utopian and impossible to achieve, at least in the next few decades. Long term, you guess, who knows, but in the foreseeable future, this agenda is going to falter, and governments will continue to roll back and reform their policies according to their national economic and geopolitical interest. And that trend, I think, will continue. And that's basically how I view, and you know that, we obviously monitor these developments internationally. We produce our newsletter so that people can see what's going on around the world. This trend has been going on for the last 18 months, but this COP has cemented the realization that energy security and the cost of energy is now dominating the conversations and the summits and the negotiations, and climate science is taking really a back seat. And that's it.